and welcome to the LØRN Book Club. I'm Silvia and my guest today is William Green, the author of Richer, Wiser, Happier. Welcome, William.
Thank you for having me. Delighted to be here.
I have a little admission to make, and it is that I grew up in old Yugoslavia while it still existed, and I read tons of big Russian books. And then I had a period of my life where I worked very much in computer science and read board documentation, and I kind of stopped reading. And then a few years ago, I got hooked on audiobooks. And usually books come my way by way of Amazon algorithms. Your book came my way by a joint friend called Guy Spear, but his description of your book made me absolutely have to read it. And I very, very much look forward to presenting it to our listeners, mainly Norwegians, mainly professionals, but we have a growing listenership in the rest of the world. So, William, we usually start by asking the author to say a few words about themselves in a way that would help people get a picture of you in their mind. How would your close friends define you?
Sure. I grew up in England, and I've been living by the pen really for the last 30 years. So I started off, I wanted to be a writer really from the age of probably about 7, I think. I had a great uncle who said to me, he was a professor of politics, and he said, "William, what do you want to do when you grow up?" And I think I surprised myself at that age by saying, I want to write. And so I've never really wanted to do anything else. I always loved books, and I always loved magazines. There's almost a sensual pleasure to holding a book. And for many years, I wrote for magazines. So I started off, I wrote book reviews for things like the London Spectator. And then I moved to America when I was about 21. So I'd studied English literature at Oxford, and I thought I was going to be a famous novelist. And then I started writing fiction and screenplays, and I found I wasn't very good at it. It was really hard. And then I wrote I guess it was an article about 2 great novelists, Ford Madox Ford and Joseph Conrad. And I sent it to the Spectator, and they published it, and they sent me a check for £70, which I thought, wow, this is fantastic. Someone's paying me for my writing. And so then I spent many years writing for magazines. Then I ended up going to Time magazine. I moved to Hong Kong, and I became first the deputy editor and then the editor of the Asian edition of Time magazine. And then I moved to London, which was my hometown, and edited the European, Middle Eastern, and African edition of Time. And then everything kind of fell apart. The magazine business fell apart, the financial crisis happened, and I got kicked out. And so I had to decide, oh God, what am I going to do with my second act? I was only 40 years old, and I had 2 young kids in private school, was living in a very expensive place in London. And I started ghostwriting books. And so that turned out actually to be an incredibly good shift for me, because you get very deeply into the lives of people that are really kind of fascinating. And in some ways, it overcame a lot of my paralysis over writing, because I had such performance anxiety with my writing. When you're writing in someone else's voice, you're not so much on trial because you're not so worried about being judged. And so it kind of cleaned the pipes in a way. And then a few years ago, I started writing my own books. And so the first one was a collaboration with an extraordinary photographer that was called The Great Minds of Investing. And then about 5 or so years ago, I started working on the book that we're here to talk about, which is called Richer, Wiser, Happier. And that's really a distillation of everything I've learned over the last 25 years, which was a kind of ridiculously ambitious project. And so in a sense, I've come back to where I wanted to be when I was in my early 20s writing books, but I had this long detour for 20 years or so working for magazines. And so so here I am at the age of 52, finally as a writing my own books and feeling like, oh, that was what I meant to do all along.
No, I think that to me, your book, well, both of these, both The Great Minds and Richer, Wiser, sound like the ultimate project, to be honest, because, you get to meet amazing people, you get to learn from them, and you get to distill it in your own mind by writing it out. I guess it's both a development project of your own as much as it's a communication project.
Yeah, and I've always been sort of full of existential angst, and I'm trying to figure out, how are you supposed to live? How do you make sense of this chaotic world? How do you make decisions given that the future is unknowable and everything is changing and impermanent? And so for me, interviewing extraordinary people and getting inside their minds is partly about addressing my own existential angst. I'm trying to figure out, how do I live? How do I think? How do I become better at what I do? How do I recover from my mistakes and my setbacks and my failures? How do I prioritize? How do I figure out what makes for a truly abundant and successful life? And so really, I'm taking advantage of the fact that I have access to absolutely extraordinary people as both a journalist and as an author. And then I'm distilling everything that I've learned in a way that helps me share those ideas with other people. And I think if it were just for me, it wouldn't quite work. There's something about teaching other people and sharing ideas that makes it much more, it's richer and more resonant. But at the same time, if it were just for other people and I didn't really have skin in the game, it wouldn't work either. And so I think the power of these projects comes from the fact that I really care. I'm not just trying to build some kind of brand or make myself successful or famous. I'm actually trying to figure out, how do I live? How do I think better? How do I invest better? What does the money even mean? Like what actually constitutes a successful life? And so for me, I've spent many years basically hanging out with these extraordinary thinkers and asking them kind of impertinent and personal questions. So I would someone like Bill Miller, who I write about in this book, he's someone who was probably the most successful and famous mutual fund manager of his generation, was managing something like $77 billion and beat the market for 15 years running, and then had this colossal failure during the financial crisis. So 100 people got laid off because of mistakes that he made. His assets under management went down from $77 billion to $800 million. And he was kind of mocked in the press. And so for me, I've interviewed him for probably 100 hours almost over the last 20 years. So when he suffered this tremendous setback, I'm talking to him about, well, so how do you deal with pain and failure and the sort of shame that comes from it and the disappointment and learning the lessons? And I'm able to do that because I'm saying to him, look, I got laid off as the editor of the European edition of Time magazine. And so I'm trying to figure out, like, how do I deal with that sense of shame and failure and the setback? And so there's blood on the page. You know, I'm not just asking this in a theoretical sense. And I think that's one reason why people talk to me in a fairly intimate and an honest way, is because it's clear that I care. And at the same time, I think I'm also very non-judgmental in interviewing these people. I'm pretty compassionate and empathetic, and I get into their heads. And so likewise, when I see Bill Miller survive that period and deal with it with tremendous honesty and self-awareness and good humor and grace and perseverance, I'm not just an objective journalist observing it. I take a kind of weird joy and satisfaction in seeing him survive this crisis and bounce back in an extraordinary way. And I'm fascinated by how he's done it. I mean, part of what he did is he was obsessed with Stoic philosophy. So here's this guy, you'd assume, oh, well, he's just a master of the universe. He's bound to be superficial and crass and just care about money. And actually, it turns out, when I first interviewed him, I said to him, who are your greatest influences, an investor? And he said, well, it's Wittgenstein and William James. And it's because it's all about misperception. It's about how to see the world more accurately. And so he bought 15% of Amazon in about 2000, 2001, at a time when most people thought it was going to go bankrupt. And he was saying, no, it's misperceived. And so here again, at a time when he was getting clobbered during the financial crisis and his career kind of fell apart for a while, once again, he's drawing on philosophy, but this time it was Stoic philosophy. So I'm sort of unpacking that with him in our interviews and saying, well, so what did the Stoics teach you? And he's saying, well, they teach you, people like Marcus Aurelius and Seneca and Epictetus, they teach you that you can't necessarily control your external circumstances, but you can control your own behavior, your own intention, your own attitude, and you can behave with honor and virtue, and you can be honest about your mistakes. You can deal with it with good humor. You can learn from your mistakes. And he said, yeah, I don't like it when he showed me a tweet where someone had written, that guy Bill Miller, he's such an asshat. And he's like, that's a bit mean. Here's a guy who doesn't even know me, and he's like swearing about me online. And he's like, but I don't have control over that. I have control over my behavior. And so for me, when I'm interviewing someone like that, I'm really thinking about, okay, so what do I control in my life? How can I deal with the fact that the world is uncertain, that we're in the midst of a pandemic, that I don't have control over mutant strains, but I do have control over my own behavior and my own attitude. And so that's in some ways a perfect example of the way that I approach investing and interviewing investors. I'm looking to figure out how to deal with a very uncertain world in which things don't always break our way. And so, yeah, it's an investing question, because the greatest investors have money riding on the future. But it's also a philosophical question. It's how do you think about uncertainty? Deal with the fact that we don't have control over all of our external circumstances.
So I'm going to unpack this a little bit. And one thing I want to say, so I did my DPhil, my PhD in Oxford. It was maths, computer science, and I got to work with some of these Turing Prize Award people, both in Oxford and in the US. And I was working with techies in a way, in a similar way that you were approaching these financial geniuses. And my experience is that they all really want to leave a legacy. And if you approach them as, human to human, with not completely uncritical, but also with lots of I can't say love, but
yeah.
Compassion, as you said, and openness, and really a desire to learn, they have an incredible amount to give that I think often they don't even know where to address in many ways. And so I think your approach is great, because I think many of these people actually need to have these conversations where they know that, this is not just some journalist looking for a scandal that, will make them the traffic numbers, but actually trying to understand. So I think that's a very valuable gift to them, but also to all of us. And the other thing I want to say is that, these are just amazing stories. And one of the things that I've seen through my podcast here. So our idea with LØRN is to capture innovation stories normally. And the idea started from, I work in a number of boards and committees and so on, and I meet all these people that have amazing ideas, and I wanted to communicate them, but in a light way. So podcasts work really easily. It's a lazy man's article, right? But then we started going down the hierarchy, and there are people, project managers, nurses, assistant nurses, that have these super interesting both stories and ideas. And so I think it's about being able to capture the stories of people who want something and going forward. And so my question to you is, in a way, turning it upside down now. Do you think this is relevant to ordinary people? So you are philosophically minded to start with, and you're wondering about, the life and universe and everything. By the way, I'm in the midst of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy for the third time.
Yeah.
So this is good timing. But what can, a person who doesn't really feel that there is, they don't have $1 billion of something to put somewhere. What do you think is the value for them from reading what you have written for us here?
Well, investing in the markets are just a microcosm of everything else, right? You're dealing with the fact that the world is uncertain, that everything changes, that the future is unknowable, and yet we have to make decisions about the future. And so whether you're getting married, deciding to move to a different country, buy a new home, have kids, get a dog, get one type of surgery or try an alternative method. You're constantly having to make these decisions under circumstances of uncertainty where you don't know the future. What the greatest investors have is they're consciously engaged in this game of making decisions about the future, but they have enormous skin in the game because there's a consequence if they're wrong. So if you're a journalist like me, or you're a professor or a pundit on TV, you don't have a lot of downside if you're wrong. It's embarrassing, maybe, but usually we just deny that we were wrong anyway, and so we don't really admit it. But if you're someone like Bill Miller, who I spoke about before, he has enormous amounts of skin in the game, and that concentrates the mind in an extraordinary way because you have to be right. And if you're not, you're a custodian of tens of thousands, possibly even millions of shareholders' life savings. They're the money that they're going to retire on, the money that they're going to pay for their kids' college with. They're enormous stakes. And so what I found is that because of the consequences of being either a good or bad investor, they have to be extraordinary pragmatists. And so they're not dogmatic. I went to visit a hedge fund manager the other day at his home in Fire Island, and he said to me, I have 4 different offices in different homes and in my office in New York City. And they're all exactly the same. And he said, look at this. I have this little bust of Lenin because it reminds me of the dangers of dogmatism, the dangers of having one fixed idea. So just think of that little example of someone who's giving himself a physical cue to remind himself that he needs not to get stuck in one idea, that he needs to be more open-minded, to question himself. And so for me, the greatest investors become this incredible filter through which to see the world because they care about what works. And so they don't care about sounding smart. They actually care about, well, does it work? Am I right? So for example, if they start studying mindfulness or Buddhism, they'll say, well, okay, so can I improve the way I invest and think by having a calmer mind? So Guy Spear, who we talked about before, Guy said to me once, one reason why I moved to Zurich, to this kind of relatively quiet, slightly bland, but very pleasant neighborhood in Zurich, is because I want my mind to be like a calm pond so that I can think clearly. That's a really interesting hack for somebody who's got a scattered mind, which I do as well. My mind's all over the place. That's a very interesting practical hack to say, okay, if I want to think more clearly, I've got to meditate, I've got to structure my physical environment in a certain way. So for me, you can learn enormous amounts from the greatest investors because they're so pragmatic. They're scouring the world, scouring every discipline, saying, what can I grab from this that could help me to think better? So think of someone like Charlie Munger, who I write about at length in this book, who's 97-year-old polymathic genius who's been Warren Buffett's partner for more than 40 years. So here's a guy who is one half of the most successful investment team that's ever existed, right? Genius guy. Spends his whole time trying to figure out how to be less stupid, how to reduce standard stupidities. And so he just goes through life saying, well, look at all of the disasters. He collects examples of what he calls inanities and asininities. And so he's looking at stupid things that people do. And then he's saying, well, what caused this problem? What caused this terrible outcome? And let me not do that. And so just that idea, that actually stems originally from Carl Gustav Jacobi, who's this 19th century algebraist who famously said, invert, always invert. So Munger is grabbing a mental model from mathematics and saying, oh, so if I invert in every other area of life, let's say as an investor, I want to be a great investor. So let's ask first, how can I be a terrible investor? What would make me a terrible investor? And then you avoid all of those standard stupidities that lead to disastrous investment outcomes. But you can apply exactly the same approach in every other area of life. So you could say, okay, if I want to have a happy marriage, what would make me a terrible spouse? And so then you list all the things and you're like, okay, so I could be unfaithful, I could shout at my wife, I could be unkind to my kids, all of these things. You know, I could pay so much attention to my work that I'm a terrible spouse. And so you list all of these things and you're like, okay, now that I've understood the standard stupidities, that helps me. It's a way of solving the problem backwards, as Munger said. And so you want to solve the problem forwards as well and say, well, how can I be a good spouse? But you also want to solve it backwards. It's a more thorough way of thinking of it. So for me, these are just a couple of examples of ways in which The Greatest Investors are a wonderful filter for how to think about problems, because they're decision makers with tremendous skin in the game. There's a consequence if they're wrong.
So there is the film Wall Street that has formed all of us to think about many of these very successful investors as sharks. But it seems like you have to be quite brutal up to a certain level, and then beyond that level you can afford to be a thinker. Is there or do you believe that these people have been wise all along?
There's a huge range, but I think if I look at someone like Munger, for example, Munger is a profoundly moral person. He's thinking about how to operate in a moral way. And so there's a beautiful quote that I often think about from Warren Buffett, who wrote a foreword to a biography of Munger. And so I can claim no credit for this quote. But Buffett once said, in the 41 years that I've known Charlie, I've never seen him take advantage of anybody. And he said he takes more of the blame and less of the credit than is due. And I've seen him knowingly take the worst end of a deal with me multiple times. So you think about that. That's a profoundly moral decision about how to do capitalism. And so one of the things that fascinates me that I explore at some length throughout this book is there an enlightened way to do capitalism where you're not leaving a trail of destruction, you're not wrecking the environment, you're not exploiting people, you're not screwing your partner, you're not gouging your shareholders. And so I could easily have written about a bunch of rapacious Wall Street guys who don't really care about how they behave and have become vastly, vastly rich by behaving like snakes. But I'm not that interested in them. Just the ability to make enormous amounts of money and buy yachts and planes is not inherently that interesting to me. I think there's a certain skill there. But I'm writing about a small minority of great investors who I regard as practical philosophers. They're thinking about what constitutes a successful and abundant life. And so for someone like Munger, he talked about a famous billionaire who was a notorious snake. And he said, look, this guy, he said, even his kids and his wives never loved him. They never liked him. They never loved him. And he's like, all through my life, I've regarded this guy as an example of what I don't want to be in life. And he said, you could say that he's more successful than me because, I have $1 billion, couple of $1 billion. He had $8 billion. But I regard his life as a failed life. That's a really interesting observation and someone said to me the other day, a hedge fund manager said to me, how do you measure success for yourself? Is it money? And it was funny. I was like, no, absolutely not. And I mean, it just didn't even occur to me that would be the measure of my own success. And so I'm very interested in this sort of small subset of investors who represent what I think it was Maynard Keynes called worldly wisdom. So they're practical philosophers. They're thinking about how to deal with risk and uncertainty, but they're also thinking about, well, isn't it better if I act in an honest and honorable way? And might that not actually be a practical advantage in life? Munger said to me, I don't deserve a lot of credit for being moral because I actually figured out that I'd make more money by being moral. It actually works. And I think he's being slightly disingenuous in saying that. I think there is a profoundly moral aspect to it, but he doesn't want to overemphasize his own morality. He doesn't want to be sanctimonious or self-righteous about it. And so that to me is a really interesting question, is it actually possible to be a really decent human being in a profession that's sharp-elbowed? And that, again, has tremendous resonance for me, because I kind of lost a political battle at some level at Time Magazine. I got kind of pushed out after doing what I thought was a really good job. And it's like, wait, so I got sacrificed, and I worked 70, 80 hours a week for 7 years, and then I get pushed out. So is it just a Darwinian world where it's all dog eat dog? And so I'm actually wrestling with that question of like, do I need to be more of a snake, or is it naive for me to think that I can behave well and things work? And one of the conclusions I've come to is both approaches work. You can be a total snake and you can maximize your success in certain ways, but failure is going to show up in other areas of your life. So maybe your kids will hate you. Maybe one of the costs is that I think you have shame. And
I think shame shows eventually, it kind of comes out.
I think so.
You were personal, so I'll be as well. I'm in this startup that our podcast actually is, and it has a B2B platform model, and we were looking for investors the last half year, and I was actually shocked by how short-termist actually most of the investors I met were. On one side they talk about look at the team and vision and so on, and then on the other hand, in practice, you find them all looking at their calculator and Excel sheet, and actually not being able to think about real exponential scenarios. And so my impression is that the people that you have chosen to write about have been more long-term rather than short-term. They're really in for the long game. That's a very optimistic view of the future, by the way. Because if you don't have that, you're going to bet for the next 3 years or 3 months, not the next 30, like, Buffett. And then the other thing is they are in it for the game rather than for the money. They really, I think, love the whole financial game and setup and the understanding of risk, as you said, and it's all about probabilities and statistics. And then the way that Buffett describes that, he won't make an investment unless he has the organic feel of that market. And it's getting to that organic feel of that I think is really admirable, because they're putting their money into stuff that they really believe in.
This point about being long-term is critically important. And there's a whole chapter that I write called Nick and Zach's Excellent Adventure that's about these two investors based in London who basically rejected everything that Wall Street did. They said, here are all of these guys who are obsessed with perishable information. They're sitting there facing their Bloomberg terminals, getting bombarded with second-to-second, minute-to-minute information that's all irrelevant. They're obsessed with the news of the day. They're obsessed with whether a company is going to beat its quarterly earnings estimates for the next 12 weeks or the next year. And they said it's all just nonsense, and we're not playing that game. And so they became obsessed with Robert Pirsig's strange philosophical novel come memoir, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is all about quality. It's this inquiry into what constitutes quality. And so they said, okay, we're going to set up this fund that's basically a kind of a metaphysical venture, basically. It's saying, how can you set up a fund that rejects all of that nonsense and that just focuses on quality in every sense of the word? And so they just sat around reading, thinking, visiting companies all around the world, thinking about what the best business models were, and focusing on what they call information with a long shelf life. And so this point about long-termism, there's a beautiful example of it, which is they said, okay, we're engaging in what we call destination analysis. So they would look at a company like Amazon, for example, which became an enormous position for them, and they still own it 16 years later. And they said, okay, what's the ultimate destination for a company like Amazon or Costco in 10, 15, 20, 30 years? And what are the inputs that the management is required to make in order to reach this desirable destination? And are they doing it? Are they treating their customers well? How are they treating their suppliers? How are they treating their employees? Are they driving down costs? Is it becoming more efficient? And so this idea of destination analysis led them to own Costco for the last 18 years, Amazon for the last 16 years. And these two guys, basically, they closed their hedge fund a few years ago, returned all the money, and are spending the second half of their lives. They retired at 45, and they're spending the second half of their lives trying to give back most of their money to society in a way that will create maximum benefit. And if you think about this one idea of destination analysis, it's really beautiful and profound, not just in investing, but in other areas of life. So you could say, okay, so what's a desirable destination in my own life? I'm 52. So let's say I make it to 85, 90, and the destination is my funeral and my wife and kids are there. How do I want them to think of me? What sort of, do I want them to look back and think, oh yeah, he had a best-selling book and he made X million dollars? Or do they want to think, he was an honorable human being and he treated us with love and he was a kind person, he tried to share ideas or whatever? That's a really interesting question, is to ask yourself, okay, what's my destination? And what are the inputs that I require to get there? And you can apply that to your health. You can say, okay, so if there's a very interesting doctor who talks about what he calls the centenarian Olympics. And so he says, what if at 100, how do I want to be able to move? What do I want my muscles to be like? How flexible do I need to be? And so then he's reversing back from that and saying, okay, so what are the inputs I need to get to 100 and be strong? It's a beautiful way to think of not only of businesses, but of your own life. And it pushes you towards the long term instead of the short term.
Yeah. I think long-termism is really important. But again, I told you I'm from Yugoslavia, and I see it's a completely messed up country. And the bits of it that are left now as well. And it's really difficult to think long-term in some parts of the world. And then if you're as fortunate as we are to live in parts of the world where you actually have a chance to think, not just 3 months ahead, but actually 30 years ahead, hopefully with health. I think
there's a beautiful line from Ben
Yeah.
Franklin. Well, Ben Franklin, sorry to interrupt you, Silvia. There's a beautiful line from Ben Franklin Munger is obsessed with Franklin. And Buffett and Munger both quote this line, which is that an empty sack can't stand straight. And that's the problem, that when you're from a country or your own life feels kind of empty, or you're fearful, it's very hard to act with a sense of abundance and long-termism and to think in these sort of more philosophical ways. You tend much more to be in survival mode. And I've seen it myself as well. When I got laid off in 2008, 2009, I wasn't thinking about, how do I build a life where I look back at the age of 90 and I was thinking, oh shit, how am I going to, how am I going to get through this terrible period? Am I going to be able to survive as a journalist? Maybe journalism's collapsing. How should I keep my kids in private school? You're thinking in a much more panicked, short-term way. But I think in a world that becomes increasingly short-term, where we're being dinged constantly by our phones and by Twitter notifications and Zoom meetings and all of these things, it's an enormous competitive advantage just to say, let me be more long-term. Let me focus on things that aren't so perishable, on information with a longer shelf life. So for example, if you shift towards reading books rather than articles, if you shift towards building relationships that enrich your life, if you shift towards exercise, eating well, these are all exercises actually in deferred gratification. So I think we know that deferred gratification is a kind of superpower, but there are all of these kind of physical and emotional pulls and tugs to make us very short term. And so when I'm writing about these guys, Nick and Zach, I write about them as an embodiment of deferred gratification. And companies like Amazon and Costco were also deferring gratification. They were saying, what Wall Street kept saying to Amazon, how come they're not making money now? And Amazon and Bezos kept saying, no, we're just going to keep shifting those revenues to our customers. We're just going to give them better and better discounts, better and better deals. And so what Nick and Zach realized is, well, that's a huge competitive advantage because they're prepared to defer their gratification. And that was the same with Costco. Costco, I think, marks up its products by something like 14%. And so Wall Street kept saying, well, why don't they have bigger margins? And Nick and Zach kept saying, well, no, they just keep treating their customer better and better and better. And so it gives them longevity. And so this idea of deferred gratification, part of the beauty of this is that it runs through business, it runs through investing, it runs through exercise, nutrition. So it becomes a kind of superpower in life. So this is the sort of thing that I'm exploring in my book, where I'm saying, no, you need to understand that this principle that the greatest investors have tapped into doesn't just affect you in terms of investing, it affects you in terms of your marriage. It affects you in terms of your relationships, your friendships, your health. And so what I'm trying to do is say, investing is just a microcosm of everything. Whether you behave in a quality way, that affects your relationships, your partnership at work, your employees, whether you defer gratification or whether you're just focused on, no, now I've got to grab everything for myself now. That affects everything in your life.
I'm going to ask you, I want to save some time for some more stories, whether it's, you visiting people in the Caribbean but maybe one or two stories that made as a visit an exceptional experience. But before I do that, I want to make two comments, maybe three. So one is, I keep thinking about Guy, our common friend. So basically, Guy and I exchange Christmas cards after never having met. But I know him. I don't know what he knows of me, but I know him through his book. And what fascinates me is that it's obviously a very good investor that also is searching life wisdom, that he's explaining his search for life wisdom. And, his willingness to sacrifice quite a lot of his time and money in order to learn as much as he can in person from people like Buffett and Munger and so on. And I was really utterly charmed by that. And I have idols, or I don't know if that's the right word, real role models like that. Again, in my case, in maths and computer science. And some of them might not even, some of them I spent a lot of time with. There is a guy called Edske Dijkstra, Dutch guy. I visited him there. I worked with him. He was later in another guy, Tony Hoare, British, Oxford, then Cambridge and so on. And they are a part of me. When I think, when I work, when I live, their influence guides me without me always being conscious of it. And I think in many ways, that's a great legacy. If you can save some of that long-term legacy and spare it and share it in a meaningful way with the world, I can't see how, a billion or two or, 70 yachts or I don't know how many Bentleys could compete with that. And that's the comment I'd really like you to make before we go into the stories. I have a feeling that the guys you describe have a connection with the world. What scares me are the one-dimensional billionaires. The guys who feel completely detached and, they want to go to the moon and they date Hollywood stars and, they want to use cryogenics to live forever without, having a stoic, holistic think about what am I a part of? I mean, what kind of a life is it if it's just you? I don't know.
Yeah, I was staying on this island with a friend the other day, and he had a hedge fund manager friend that I was talking to, and the guy's really interesting and really smart. It's clear that he's kind of brilliant. And I'm talking to him about some of this sort of more philosophical, more spiritual stuff, and it's clear there's just kind of nothing going on there. And you're just like, this is a dead end. This is a guy who's a really good game player. He's really good at cracking the problem of how to invest. And that's a talent, but it's not very interesting to me. And so there were a few times where I started to write about someone in this book who was a billionaire, who was an extraordinary investor, who I'd spent a really interesting amount of time interviewing. And it almost felt as if the body rejected this organ. That once I started writing about it, I'm like, this guy leaves me cold. I just don't want to write about them. I'm just not that interested. And so one of the great quirks of this book is that I've ended up writing about people that I tend to like and find admirable and interesting. And so one of the greatest risks that I took is that I end the entire book by writing at length about this guy called Arnold Vandenberg, who no one really had heard of. And I'm trying to explain, here's why I regard Arnold as the most successful human being I've ever encountered in the investment business, and why for me he embodies what an actually successful and truly abundant life is. And Arnold said to me, and I use this as kind of the quote that opens that section of the book, he said, "I'm the richest man in the world." And he said to me, this has nothing to do with money. It's relationships, it's health, he's such a decent bloke. And so I tell his story, which is extraordinary, which I'm trying to explain. This is what actually constitutes an abundant and successful life. And one of the reasons his life is so extraordinary is because, unlike many of these people, he was dealt the worst possible hand. And so many of these guys, they started off, they had loving families, they were sent to Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard Business School or Yale or Wharton. They had every advantage. This guy Arnold is given the worst possible hand. He starts off, he's born in 1939 on the same street as Anne Frank. There's a Jewish kid during the Holocaust. And so he spends the first couple of years of his life in hiding. And at a certain point, his parents decided, well, if the Nazis come and explore this house where we're being hidden behind this fake wall, if Arnold or his brother Sigmund cry or make a noise, we're all going to get killed. And so they decide, we need to get in touch with the Dutch underground and see if they can get Arnold and Sigmund out of Amsterdam. And so this 17-year-old girl, who they didn't know, risks her own life and the life of her entire family to smuggle Arnold out of Amsterdam to an orphanage in the countryside. And so many years later, Arnold, who had this tremendously difficult childhood, I mean, his parents were both in Auschwitz, but actually survived. And he was so malnourished that he couldn't even walk by the time he was 6. He was just shuffling around on his knees. And many years later, he was in therapy, and he said to this psychiatrist, "I don't understand why that girl saved my life. Why would she risk her life for this total stranger?" And his therapist said, "Well, it's simple." And I was like, "Well, tell me why. Why is it simple?" And the guy said, "Well, for some people, their life is worth more than their principles. And for other people, their principles are worth more than their life." And Arnold sees this and thinks about this girl who saved his life. And he thinks, well, let me try to lead a life of principle that's actually worthy of the people who risked their lives to save me. And so here's a guy, he barely made it through high school. And he once heard his mother talking to a psychologist and saying, well, we think probably he had brain damage from being so malnourished as a child. And so he had no advantages. Even you would like to think, well, his parents survived Auschwitz, they were victims, they had a terrible life. It's more complicated. His father came out and used to beat him up. And so Arnold felt like his parents had abandoned him. He didn't understand that his parents had no choice about him going to this orphanage, that they were trying to save his life. But he felt emotionally like his mom didn't want him, and that's why he was sent away, because he was such a little boy. What did he know?
But he didn't become bitter. For
years he had tremendous rage. And what's so fascinating to me is that he was able to reverse that rage. And so here's a guy dealt the worst possible hand, emotionally full of rage. His first wife left him for another man, and so he hated her, he resented his parents, he hated the Germans, he hated the Nazis, and yet he then takes control over his inner life, and he became obsessed with self-hypnosis. And so he basically rewired his mind. And he loved affirmations and the like. So he would go around just saying all the time, no, I'm a loving person. And so gradually over many years, for someone like me as a kind of Oxford-educated, cerebral intellectual, I would typically in the past have rolled my eyes at this. I would have thought, it's kind of puerile. And now I realize one of his great advantages is that when he read books about how to take control over your mind and how to rewire your consciousness, he took it deadly seriously. He never went to college. He never had these kind of prejudices, this intellectual snobbery that blinds people like me. And so when he read a self-help book or a philosophical book or a spiritual book, he took it deadly seriously. And so he just transformed himself into this incredibly loving, kind, philanthropic, decent person. So for me, he embodies a couple of great lessons for all of us. One of which is, it doesn't matter how rich you are, you need to take care of your internal landscape, your inner landscape. You need to figure out where you're going to get your equanimity from, where you're going to get your peace of mind from during the difficult times. Because one of the things I write about is that all of these great investors, no matter how fortunate they seem from the outside, they've all gone through the ringer. You look at someone like Charlie Munger, his first son died of leukemia at the age of 9. And Munger then divorced, he lost all of his money. And so here's a guy, he later lost his eye. He's a guy who's had an immensely successful life, and yet had a great deal of pain in it. And so one of the things that Munger says is simply that the ability to view adversities as an opportunity either to behave well or badly is a very good approach in life. It's a very practical conclusion. You look at someone like Bill Miller, who I talked about before, saying, well, the Stoics show me what can I control and what can't I control. Let me control my own behavior and attitude. Or you look at Arnold Vandenberg saying, well, let me rewire my mind. So instead of thinking of myself as a victim of all of these things, at a certain point he said, I've forgiven the Nazis. I've forgiven the Germans. I've forgiven my ex-wife. I just want to be more loving. I just want to help people, be kinder. And so when I look at Arnold and I see how generous-spirited he's become, how appreciative of his gifts, how, the kind of relationship that he's built with his wife and kids, I'm so awed by that, because I can see, well, here's a guy who got dealt the worst possible cards, and yet he's played them so brilliantly that his life has been a success. And so for me, I had loving parents, and I was sent to Eton and Oxford and Columbia. I was given everything. So if Arnold can, it's not like I didn't have my problems, but if Arnold can turn his life around with all of the challenges that he had, then I sure as hell can do it for myself. And one of the things that I did when I spent a couple of days with Arnold in Austin, Texas, where he lives, is I got hypnotized by him. I lay down on the floor of his study while he played Vivaldi's Four Seasons, and he said, "No, William, I'm going to change your consciousness, because you're giving yourself all of these messages that are limiting you and that are making your life worse, and you have to change the way you speak to yourself and the way you think." And there's something, I think he's right, that I think it really helps if you change the way you talk to yourself and the way you think, because I do think your consciousness creates your reality. And B, there's something just so lovely about the fact that an 81-year-old, very successful money manager is spending his time trying to hypnotize a 52-year-old English writer so that he can improve his life. And I think that gets at a great secret, which is the reason Arnold is the richest man in the world is because he spends his whole time trying to help people like me.
He has an infinite amount to give, basically.
Yeah, I have a trampoline outside that he sent me because he was worried that I'm too lazy and slothful. And so, I put it in my yard where the next door neighbor's kids can use it as well. And there's something just really lovely about the sort of person who's thinking, how can I help people? How can I share? And Arnold said to me at one point that his hobby is giving away books, because he said a book can transform a person's life. So what could be a greater thing than for me to give people books? And so amazing to describe your hobby as giving away books.
Mm. Yeah.
So he's probably sent me 25 books over the years.
And he's shaped you and formed you. And that might be a reward enough for him.
And he's shaped me in the sense that I have a clearer sense of what will make for a happy and abundant life for me. Yeah. And I can see, that I have to take control of my inner landscape, which means that I take things like exercise and meditation really seriously, because I know that I become more anxious and more fearful if I'm not exercising or if I'm not meditating. So I do both of those things very regularly, which I never would have done before. And B, I know that I'm going to be much happier if I'm trying to help other people. It's a paradox. If I look out for myself, I'm going to be miserable.
Yeah. William, I want to say something, and then I want to ask you about Soros. And the thing I want to say is, you talk about, how these people, many of them kind of live a life outside of themselves. They give, they leave, they share. But most of us think, yeah, but first I have to make it, and then I'll have some overflow. And I think that's probably the mental mistake many of us make, because you have to make some sort of first of all, it requires probably a bit of madness and a lot of courage to make it in their way.
Mm.
And the other thing is, if we all think, well, I'll just pay off my mortgage, or I'll just pay off my credit card or something, and then I will become this giving, sharing person, we'll
Mm.
never get there.
I think it's a very profound point, and I became friends with Tony Robbins over the years, and one thing that he often says is that if you can't give away $10 when you have $1,000, then when you have $1 million or $1 billion, you're not going to be able to give money away either. It's about the mindset. And I write about Sir John Templeton, who was probably the greatest global stock picker of the 20th century, who I spent a day with in the Bahamas 20 or so years ago. And he talked about super tithing. And he said, yeah, I think the way he explained it was that he would give away $10 for every dollar that he spent on himself. But he said to me at the time, tithing is actually the best investment you can make, to give away 10% of your income, say. And at the time, I kind of thought he was a moron. And I thought, here's this guy who's totally self-righteous and sanctimonious, and he wants to tell me how charitable he is and how pious he is. And it kind of irritated me. And over the years, I've totally changed my attitude, and I realized, God, I was so blind and so prejudiced and so biased that I couldn't see clearly what he was trying to tell me. And I think this idea of understanding that you have to give away money, that you can be as mystical as you want or as practical as you want about it. But I think at some level, you don't want to be controlled by your money or by your fear that you're not going to have enough. And there's something about loosening up, softening up enough to say, no, I come from such a place of abundance. I have such trust that I'm going to be okay in the future, that it's okay for me to give away money. And it doesn't mean you want to be stupid about it and give away, half of your money, but to be able to say, yeah, you made $50,000 this year. Let me give away $2,000, $3,000. Or you make a couple of $100,000. Let me give away 15, 20, 30. I think just that understanding that it actually benefits you in terms of your feelings about yourself, the type of person you are. You look at yourself and you think, God, I'm a decent person. I have all my flaws. I do all these terrible things. I shout at my kids or I kick the dog or whatever, but I'm fundamentally trying to be a better person. I'm not saying these are things I do, although I have shouted at my kids plenty of times, but haven't kicked my dog, I don't think. But I think to know that you're working on yourself and you're trying to become more giving and sharing, I think there's a tremendous amount of self-respect that comes from it. And also, you're breaking that fear that you're not going to have enough, you're not going to be okay. And I've come from that place of fearfulness a lot over the years. And so one of the things that Arnold taught me when he was trying to change the way I talk to myself was to tell yourself, no, I'm prosperous. I'll always be prosperous. I come from a place of abundance. And for me to change my wiring so that instead of that kind of fearfulness, that you have a sense of, God, I'm so appreciative of all the blessings that I have in my life, and I want to share the blessings. I would have rolled my eyes at that attitude 25 years ago. I would have thought it was kind of naive and overly sentimental. And now I look at it and I'm like, what a moron I was. I was so busy being intelligent and cynical and sarcastic that I couldn't understand these basic, very simple truths. That it's like, no, I should have more sense of appreciation, more sense of abundance, more sense of my own good fortune, and I should try to share with other people. And so I think because Arnold didn't have this kind of bias of the sort of Ivy League type education, he tapped into worldly wisdom, practical wisdom. He was just thinking, well, let me become more loving. what a wonderful thing to understand that.
So this is where I get a little bit confused by your intentional disconnection idea.
Mm.
I mean, something Buddhist about it, but aren't we trying to achieve the opposite?
The phrase intentional disconnection, if I remember rightly, I use in talking about Nick and Zach, these two investors in England that I was talking about, where most people are trying to stay plugged into the news all of the time, all of these short-term inputs. They're trying to react to what just came on their Bloomberg terminal. What's happening to inflation, what's happening in macroeconomic terms. And I think this kind of, so when I'm talking about intentional disconnection, in a sense, it's largely about technology. It's saying, no, let me not look at my phone so much. Let me not obsess about the daily news. Let me not try to prognosticate about where inflation's going, where the economy is going, because that stuff is unknowable. If Buffett and Munger can't figure it out, why the hell should I be able to? And so let me instead focus on things that are more meaningful, information that has a longer shelf life. Let me think about things like destination analysis. Where's this business headed? Where's this economy? What will it take for this economy to succeed? Are the government doing things that are beneficial, or are the inputs terrible? And what about my own behavior? Is it leading to a desirable destination, or is it too short term? And so I see intentional disconnection as a kind of strategy in terms of your personal habits. And I write about this extraordinary woman, Laura Geritz, who's a fascinating and international investor. And one of the things she said to me is, look, I've traveled to 75 countries. She travels 6 to 9 months a year. But one of the things she's doing the whole time is she literally every Friday, for example, is what she calls creative day. And she just goes and sits by a stream and writes in her journal, reads books. She reads 2 or 3 books a week. So she's not obsessed with the daily news. She's thinking about what's happening with robotics down the road, what's happening with automation, what's happening with work habits. And then she's planting herself in other countries where she'll just say, let me go live in Turkey for a while so I can get a better sense of the culture. So she's giving herself an informational advantage by studying countries in a very deep way, studying different cultures, reading books, studying companies. And so the intentional disconnection is from all of the short-term nonsense, all of the calls to action and short-term stimuli that most of us obsess with. And so for me, this has had a profound impact on my own life, because I have to say, well, yeah, I have to use Twitter and stuff because it's important for me to build an audience. And I used to dismiss things like Twitter as being really superficial and dumb. I actually think it's a really, really interesting ecosystem. And so that's something that's fairly short term that I have to engage with. But I also, I'm in a book group where we just read classic fiction, and we're all writers pretty much. And we just finished reading Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. We read Anna Karenina. We read Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Book by Mahfouz, Palace Walk. We're trying to decide what Shakespeare play we're going to read as our next project. So I'm intentionally thinking, okay, so what's perishable and what's not perishable? Mm-hmm. If I spend my whole time on Twitter and reading today's news and angsting about today's news, is that going to prevent me reading good fiction and building friendships with the people in my book group and building relationships with my kids? So the intentional disconnection is a kind of deepening where you're saying, let me go for stuff that's actually really going to enrich my knowledge, enrich my life, build my relationships. And so that it goes with another idea that I talk about at some length, which is what I call the art of subtraction, where you're saying most people are adding complexity to their lives. let me reduce complexity. So for someone like Laura Geritz, who I mentioned before, she says, well, everything is just about countries and companies. That's what I need to focus on. So she's married, but she doesn't have kids, and she just is focusing constantly on building her knowledge of companies and countries. For me, if I apply that idea of the art of subtraction, I say, okay, so what's really important in my life? My family is massively important. I have a lovely wife, I have 2 kids who are lovely. That's critically important for me. My writing is really important to me. Reading is really important to me. Building my knowledge, things like meditation, my spiritual life, they're very important to me. I don't really like exercise, but I know that it's important. So at the start of the pandemic, because I know that there are certain things I can control and others that I can't control, I was probably 20, 25, 30 pounds overweight. So we bought a Peloton. So I've done like 500 rides since then. So I'm healthier. So that's important to me. I know that peace of mind is important. And so I try to meditate pretty regularly. So I'm kind of reducing complexity, and I'm saying, what can I subtract from my life? Because if I spend my time on nonsense that's away from that core of 5 or 6 things, how can I build what's truly a successful life if I know that relationships are critical, if I know that my writing and my sharing ideas is critical, I know that peace of mind and health is critical. There isn't much time for anything else. And so for your readers, I think, for your listeners, I would really encourage them just to go through this process of saying, well, what really matters to me? What am I best at? And what games am I equipped to win? And what do I care most about? And then subtract rather than adding short-term nonsense and complexity. Really think about how to subtract. And I think that's what the greatest investors do the whole time.
I think some of this is harder than it sounds, because so I have 4 kids and too much to do. And so we have had to make some really hard choices about not being social, basically, in order to survive. And some people view it as rudeness or aloofness or, elitism. I don't know. There are many ways to interpret these kinds of priorities. But what you're saying is that it's more important to be honest to yourself long term than to try to play a few roles too many.
I think you have to really ask yourself, what am I best at and what do I care most about? And one of the most obvious lessons that you learn from the greatest investors is they really only play games that they can win. And so they're pretty ruthless about saying, someone like Bill Miller, for example, said to me, yeah, what the money gives me is I don't have to do any of this stuff like decorate my own home, pump gas, fly on a commercial airline. He's like, I've stripped away all of that stuff that I don't like doing and where I add no value. All I'm doing is try to add value every month for my clients. That's all I'm trying to do. So he's just reading massively, thinking brilliantly, learning stuff so that he can add value for his clients. So he's reduced a lot of the complexity in his life so that he can focus on continuously learning about markets, investing and the like. And he does that in the broadest possible way because he's studying chaos theory. He was on the board of the Santa Fe Institute. He's very involved in mathematical research. He's studying pragmatic philosophy. I mean, he's drawing on everything to help him crack this problem of how to think well about markets, but he's reduced all of the other complexity. And so I think it requires a certain self-awareness to say, well, yeah, I'm a bit idiosyncratic. I'm a bit of a mutant, but this happens to be what matters to me. And so for me personally, I think part of having a rich and happy life includes reading great fiction. And this is one thing where Guy Spears says, look, I think Charlie Munger's wrong because Charlie Munger is absolute genius who reads, multiple books a week, but he only reads nonfiction. And Guy is like, well, look, my life is much happier and better for the fact that I read War and Peace last year. And so he's like, so Charlie's wrong about some things. And I don't know, maybe Charles is right for him.
Yeah.
But for me, part of having a rich and abundant life includes having a book group where I can read great fiction while having really delicious food and drinking wine and chatting with old friends. That's really valuable, even though it actually takes me away from the core of writing and focusing on my family. And so I just think you have to be honest about the fact that we can't do everything. So play the game you're good at, and you know, focus on what matters most to you, and be somewhat ruthless about cutting out the rest. But I think Silvia,
the courage to be ruthless is also an important part of what we are saying. Well, I'll let you finish the sentence, and I know we are over time, but I can't stop. So I really want you to comment afterwards on 3 people, and kind of you can do it, you know, if off the top of your mind, shoot from your hip. One is Soros. The other one is I don't know if you how close or, you know.
Soros I've never interviewed, so I can't tell you anything about Soros except for he wrote this book, The Alchemy of Finance, that I read many, many years ago. And there was a fascinating thing in it that's the one thing I remember, which is that he said at a certain point, it wasn't clear whether he was running his fund or the fund was running him. And B, he said that he could actually, that there were moments where his back started to hurt. And it was like his body was telling him that there was something wrong with his portfolio. And I remember interviewing a famous investor called Jeff Vinnick, who was managing the biggest mutual fund in the world when he was about 33. And Vinnick said to me that when he bought a stock that everybody hated, that had been plunging, that he thought was an incredible bargain, he said that he felt physically sick. And I think that's really extraordinary, that the greatest investors would be so attuned to their physiology that it would actually influence the way they invested. And so sometimes, so I think part of being a high performer in any area is to have this kind of deep sense of how your body works, to look at yourself and say, oh yeah, I can see how fearful I am. Why? What's triggering me right now? And so I do think that there's something really fascinating to learn from Soros. But for me, that was it. It's the link between your physiology and your decision making.
Yeah. To me, first of all, I think they are super masters of understanding and playing risk and stacking the odds. And they know when they're playing a game that's a tad too high, even for them. And there's something about that, necessary courage, which fascinates me. But with Soros, he has this, I'm originally Hungarian. He has the same surname as me. And I've kind of been always very proud of him. And he's been criticized a lot in Hungary for mixing with politics. But again, to me, this is an extension of him doing what he believes is necessary and right. And it reminds me a little bit of Mayor Bloomberg and so on. So I'm very fascinated by them playing an even higher game. And then when it comes to, I wanted to ask you, so you're talking about people that have very similar cultural background to you. And I don't mean necessarily Eton and Oxford, but I mean Anglo-Saxon, Western world, capitalism and so on. And so one more person there that is obviously criticized, whether it's the greatest son of the bitch of Wall Street, or is there one person there that you could comment on where their ruthlessness, their lack of social antennas or drives might actually be a real strength to their business and therefore doing good? And then the third one is, I'd like to ask you if there is somebody completely outside of your culture. So, Jack Ma, Kai-Fu Lee, somebody on the other side.
Yeah. A lot of the greatest investors have low EQ, I would say. They tend to be unemotional. And so the thing that makes them extraordinary investors is often that they're very dispassionate. So when the market is crashing and most people are seeking safety with the herd, they're all bailing out, they're all panicking with the herd. The greatest investors are just looking at this in an entirely dispassionate way and saying, oh, this became cheaper, let me buy. And so there's a very interesting example of a guy I actually like a great deal, called Howard Marks, who manages about $150 billion, who I describe at length in the book. I write about him as kind of the philosopher king of finance. He's a very interesting man. And during the financial crisis, there was a period where over 15 weeks, basically every week, he and his partner, Bruce Karsh, were investing $500 to $600 million in busted bonds that everybody else was terrified to own. And I said to him, was it emotionally difficult for you? And he said, no, I don't remember it being difficult at all. And I knew that he'd been married a couple of times. And so I said, is that lack of emotion a problem in your relationships? And he said, oh yeah, in my first marriage, it was very difficult. But he said, I've become better at it. And I thought there was something really kind of beguiling about the fact that he was self-aware enough to know, yeah, I'm pretty unemotional. And to be honest about it, very direct. But clearly that lack of emotion is a mixed blessing, right? And Charlie Munger has the same thing. During the financial crisis, Munger bought a stock, a bank at what he called the bottom tick in 2009. And again, I said to him, was it difficult? And he's like, no. And I said, so you're not feeling those emotions like fear and worry? And he's like, no. And he said, and Warren's wired exactly the same way. We don't feel it. And so you could say that some of these people in some ways are emotionally stunted. It's difficult, right? I mean, they're a social. I interviewed one billionaire who I can't remember. He has an incredible art collection. I don't write about him much because I don't much like him. And I said to him at the start, can I take a photograph of you? Because it's kind of helpful as a reporter. You'd have him next to his beautiful paintings. And I'd have it. It means I don't have to take tons of notes because I'd actually be able to recreate the scene in my writing. And so I said, can I take a photo of you? He said, no. And I said, how come? And he said, I don't want you to. That's a really interesting thing, right? That's someone with a real lack of social skills. And he's an incredibly smart guy. He's a brilliant problem solver. But he leaves me a little cold. And the fact that he's a multi-billionaire doesn't make me admire him so much that I'm prepared to spend months writing about him. So I'm not making kind of moral judgments about these people. I mean, I'm a mutant in my own special way. But you have to, I think it's helpful to be self-aware and say, well, am I, for example, wired to be unemotional in the same way as these people? And I can see that I'm just much more fearful than a lot of them. That I mean, I come from a kind of Jewish immigrant background from Russia, Poland, and Ukraine. We were persecuted for centuries. We have a sense that things fall apart. And so I think I come at life naturally from a slightly fearful, anxious place. And I remember interviewing one of the great investors, and he said to me, I said to him, yeah, I'm a little bit of a pessimist. I've worked on it over the years, and I'm less of a pessimist now. But he said to me, yeah, well, good luck with that. And it was like, that's not very helpful with investing. You kind of need to be, you need to be skeptical, but you also need to have a sense that the future holds good things. And so this actually is one of the things I've tried to work on in terms of my own character over the years, to have a sense that, no, actually, this is part of my wiring, part of my kind of emotional, psychological DNA. But I can actually reverse that in the same way that Arnold Vandenberg took all of his rage and hatred and sense of victimization and became loving. There's no reason why I can't become more appreciative, more grateful, more loving, kinder, more compassionate. And so that's part of what I'm trying to do, inspired by people like Arnold, is actually to rewire myself. And so I think the pessimism that I've inherited culturally and the sense of fear isn't my destiny. It's a choice. And so I'm working on it.
Yeah. I think that a bit of paranoia, or even as long as it doesn't turn into fatalism, might actually be a good driving force. You know, at least it doesn't make you too comfortable and too sedated.
But it may make you unhappy. And so we were wired to survive. but we weren't necessarily wired to be happy. And so I'm trying to rewire myself in ways that will make me happier. And I would have thought, A, that was impossible, or B, that it was naive. And I don't think that's the case anymore. I think you can change your consciousness in very important ways. And look, part of what we see with things like scientific studies of loving kindness meditation, which I don't do very often, but you can see that just by doing these simple meditations where you say to yourself over and over again things like, may you be happy, may you be safe, may you live with ease, may you live in peace, may you be healthy, things like that. If you say that over and over again to yourself in your meditation, and then you say it to yourself as well, so you say, may I be happy, may I live with ease, you rewire your mind at a certain point. And I tend to do a kind of morning connection most mornings where I do a certain number of prayers, and I think of it as like, I'm just rewiring my mind. And so there's one that's about becoming more truthful. There's one that's about appreciation. And it's really interesting to me that these kind of spiritual gurus figured out 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago what the scientists now are figuring out about the power of appreciation. Or when you look at books like Altered Traits, where it talks about by this friend of mine, Dan Goleman, who wrote the book on EQ, you can actually see the brains, how the wiring of meditators is changing. So these ancient spiritual practices like prayer and meditation, I think they figured out, whether through divine inspiration or trial and error, whatever you like to think, they figured out how to rewire our brains. And I think that's what people like Arnold Vandenberg figured out as well through trial and error. And because the greatest investors are just pragmatists. They're just, Munger says, I just observe what works and what doesn't work and why. They're so open-minded and non-dogmatic that they figure out all of these things that kind of help them. They're like, okay, meditation, yeah, I'll do that. Okay, prayer, okay, I'll do that. Exercise, yeah, I'll do that. And I mean, I have a friend that I write about who quit the investment business to become a neurologist. And one of the things he taught me is that basically you're prone to make terrible decisions when you're in various states, like he has this mnemonic called PS, where he says, when you're hungry, angry, lonely, tired, in pain, stressed, scared, sad, you're much more likely to make terrible decisions. So in those circumstances, he's sufficiently self-aware. He's looking at his own physiology and he's saying, oh yeah, I'm in a state where I need to be extremely careful. I shouldn't be making an important decision about my stock portfolio in this state. But more recently, he's been treating COVID patients. And when he was working in a hospital at the height of COVID, in a room full of people on ventilators who were dying, he's literally using that same mnemonic that he used as a hedge fund manager to remind himself, well, look, I have to call the family of this dying patient and they can't visit their relative. And I have to call them and I have to remind myself that I'm actually in physical pain because I've been wearing this PPE equipment all day and my back's hurting and it's pinching my face and I'm exhausted. And he had a 4-day-old child that he couldn't see because he was staying in a hospital, in a hotel. So he'd be away from his wife and his newborn son. And so he's like, I know that I'm in a state where I'm likely to behave poorly and where I'm likely to make poor decisions. So I just have to remind myself to be that much more compassionate when I'm calling their families and that much more compassionate and patient when I'm treating these patients. And so slow everything down because I know that I'm in a state where I'm going to make terrible decisions. And so just to have that kind of practical knowledge of how to approach decision making, that's had a huge effect on me. When I see myself becoming kind of flooded emotionally or too fearful or too worried or overwhelmed or scattered, I can just be like, okay, so I need to reduce complexity. I need to simplify. One of the things, this friend of mine, he's called Ken Schubenstein, he's an extraordinary guy. He said to me, look, there are 4 things that we know affect the performance of our brain. So you know that sleep helps, that good nutrition helps, that meditation helps, and that exercise helps. So he said, whenever things are getting out of control and you can't think clearly, he's like, let me simplify, let me cancel as much as I can and get back to those 4 basic things. So just think of the power of those 2 basic ideas of the halt PS mnemonic and, you know, not making decisions in that state, and of just saying, let me simplify my life and get back to exercise and meditation and eating well and sleeping well. And that, for me, that's what I mean when I talk about these guys as kind of practical philosophers. They're going through life figuring out what works and doesn't work and why. And for me, that's just such a powerful filter, because they've done all the work for me, right? So I don't really want to exercise. It's like the most tedious thing, and it's uncomfortable. The last thing I want to do is sit on my Peloton bike by my washing machine and dryer in the basement of my house. It's not exactly glamorous, right? But when I'm really stressed and I'm overworked, I actually need to remind myself, no, that's actually kind of mission critical. Like when I'm more stressed and I'm more overwhelmed and I'm more scattered, I need to get back to these basic things. And so that ability just to focus on what works and what's critically important and what will help you think better, that's been hugely helpful for me.
William, I think we have really good practical ideas here. I'm really looking forward to listening to your book as both a good practical guide, but also just a really like a treasure trove of great stories told with compassion. I'm not going to take us into China and Confucius at the moment, because I just think we've exhausted our listeners. I want to say 1,000 thanks for your time and for the inspiration and for all the great work and thinking that has gone into this project so we could learn. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been lovely chatting with you.